On Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., the team files into their development area for their first sprint planning. Although Louise has already been announced as their Scrum Master, since this is the team's first sprint planning session, Alan takes the opportunity to introduce the goal of today's planning session for everyone's benefit. "Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your first sprint planning," says Alan. "Today we're going to collaborate to answer two questions about the next sprint. What can we deliver as a product increment as a result of this sprint? And how will we work together to deliver that increment?" But before we dive into those questions, since this is our first sprint planning session as a team, there are two pieces of housekeeping regarding how this sprint will run that I'd like to remind you of. The first is that sprints can be any duration up to 1 month, with 1 week, 2 week, and 1 month being the most common durations within that. Since this is our first time working in sprints, we've chosen to start with 2-week sprints. This strikes a nice balance between a sprint that's not too long or one that's not too short, so it's an ideal duration for a team that's new to Scrum to start with. And while we're discussing our sprint length, remember that since today is a Wednesday, we'll be planning a 2-week sprint that starts today and completes at the end of the day Tuesday after next. The second point I'd like to remind you of is that the Scrum framework specifies that a sprint planning session for a 1-month sprint should be 8 hours, while planning sessions for shorter sprints should be proportionately shorter. Since we're planning a 2-week sprint, we'll time box today's session at 4 hours. As another reminder, a time box is a fixed period of time that we agree upon in which we try to accomplish a task. So in the case of today's sprint planning session, we've agreed that we'll allow ourselves no more than 4 hours to complete planning. If 4 hours elapse and we're not done, then we'll simply move forward with the work that we have and we'll look for ways to improve our efficiency next time. Suddenly, Priyanka, the team's tech lead, raises her hand. "Thanks for the explanation of the length of today's session, but actually I have a question about our start date as well, Alan. Why are we starting the sprint on a Wednesday? Since our sprint aligns to weeks, wouldn't it make much more sense for the sprint to start on a Monday and then end on the next Friday?" Alan looks on while a few other team members nod their head in agreement. "That's a great question, Priyanka, and it's one that Louise and I struggled with as well when we were preparing for this first sprint. Although laying out sprints to match calendar weeks does at first seem to make planning easier, there's actually a catch to it that most teams ultimately trip over. Most holidays an organization observes are usually observed on either a Monday or a Friday, especially if that holiday happens to fall on a weekend. But also, think about how often you've taken a single vacation day. How many times have you tried to schedule that individual vacation day on a Monday or a Friday so you can have a 3-day weekend? Or have tried to schedule on a Friday if your organization is actually observing another holiday on the following Monday to get a 4-day weekend? It's okay, you don't have to raise your hand. We all do it, and it happens in every organization that I work with. While these Monday and Friday holidays and vacation days work out great for the team, they actually wreak havoc with a sprint. Imagine trying to plan 2 weeks worth of work for your next sprint if half of your team is out for a 3-day weekend. Or imagine trying to decide when to hold the sprint review if you've just found out that your company will be closed on that Friday. Do you shorten the sprint by 1 day to account for the holiday, or do you extend it by 1 day, but push the next sprint over by next day, and on and on? There really isn't a great answer on how to handle this. Wednesdays, on the other hand, are one of the least popular days for either vacation or observed holidays because they fall directly in the middle of the week. If you need to choose a day when most of your team is most likely to be in the office, then Wednesday is a great choice. Wednesday also has the added advantage that unless it's a holiday weekend, your team will usually have about 1.5 days after the weekend to wrap up any final work ahead of your Tuesday afternoon sprint review. And you'll have 2.5 days to gain momentum after your Wednesday morning sprint planning before you're interrupted again by the weekend. But I'll mention one more advantage just in case I haven't convinced you yet. I mentioned before that laying out sprints Monday through Friday seems to make sprint planning easier, and in the short term it can. But months usually don't start or end on Mondays or Fridays, and years, of course, usually don't either. So although laying out sprints Monday through Friday does make planning easier at first, once you start considering the longer term plans, you'll realize that your sprints will never actually line up perfectly with calendar months or years, regardless of which day they start on. With all remaining questions regarding sprint duration out of the way, Alan then moves on to a few introductions. Next, I'd like to introduce the key people on this Scrum team, which is actually everyone in this room. Scrum teams are made up of 3 separate players. The first is Louise, your new Scrum Master. Although you've worked with Louise in the past as a software engineer, Louise's new role is to be responsible for ensuring that everyone on the team understands and adheres to the Scrum framework. He will be facilitating most of the Scrum ceremonies and working to remove any impediments that keep your team from being as effective as possible. The next person I'd like to introduce is Dave, your product owner. Dave is responsible for maximizing the value that you produce as a Scrum team. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that Dave's job is to get you to constantly work harder or faster. What this actually means is that Dave is accountable for ensuring that the work the team is doing is always the absolute highest value work that they can be doing at that time. This also means that Dave will need to work with Louise to understand the team's capacity so he knows how much work everyone can accomplish in a given time, so that once again, he can ensure that the work that the team is currently working on is the work that's the most valuable to the organization. And finally, I mentioned 3 players. Well, the third player is you. Everyone else in this room, aside from Dave and Louise, comprises this Scrum team's development team. The development team is the part of the Scrum team that's accountable for actually creating and delivering the product increment that we'll be discussing in today's sprint planning session. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I'm not a developer. But in the language of the Scrum framework, everyone who is responsible for delivering the product increment is considered a developer. This means that whether you're a technical lead like Priyanka, a software engineer like Josh, or a tester like Peter, from here on out, all of you are now considered developers. This is because the Scrum framework considers the development team as a cross-functional team that's completely capable of delivering the selected product increment without any dependency on the broader organization. This means that we all have the skills we need to deliver our product increment right here in this room. Now, this doesn't mean that each of you do not have specialized skills, such as architecture, coding, or testing, all of which I'm sure will come to bear in delivering this product increment. But please understand that you're all accountable as a whole for the completion of the product increment. So you must work together as a cohesive team. And while we're on the subject of the development team, I'd also like to call out that your team size is also very intentional. The Scrum framework specifies a team size of 3 to 9 members. This is because teams smaller than 3 usually do not possess all the skills necessary to complete the product increment independently. And teams larger than 9 often find that the work and the communication across the team usually becomes too difficult to coordinate. On your development team, there are 3 cross-functional team members, which, while it's on the small side, is a great place to start for an organization who's first dipping their toes into the Scrum framework.